6027 Part 1. Item 6027 was a simple man in his earlier years. As a kid, he attended school and didn't make much of a splash. He did his homework, listened to his parents, and did his chores. He was the perfect kid, quiet, and did his work. So he wondered every day why they chose him to abduct and experiment on. Sometimes it was just too much. He'd scream that question from his cell and he'd hear the other prisoners join him. Some cries were in languages he didn't understand, but pain was a universal language. He'd been there so long he didn't even know his own age anymore. He faintly remembered his 8th birthday, but now he had a long salt and pepper beard. Every night, or day, or whatever passed for time in this void of space, he was taken from his cell and used. Most times, the creatures used knives to cut into his body. A creature he decided to call Morg seemed to especially enjoy cutting into his belly. At least, he thought it was enjoyment. His captors didn't exactly have faces to know what it was. But those were the easy days. His captors had some way to heal him instantly, and they were very creative when it came to removing things from inside him. Either out of spite or forgetfulness, they would occasionally forget to use this miracle fluid on him, and he would be sightless for a few hours, or without a limb or two. One time they managed to forget to apply the fluid right away after removing his heart, and he was dead for an undetermined amount of time. That was the one time that he got to feel bliss. His only real solace was the other prisoners. He never met any of them, as they were never allowed to leave their cells when they weren't part of an experiment. But at least the guards didn't stop them from talking. From what he could tell, there were 9 other humans, all of various ages, race, and genders. The only thing they had in common was their species. 3 of them hadn't known English when they were taken, but fortunately some of the other humans could translate for them. They shared stories of their pasts with each other. One man was a mechanic, taken while he was repairing some rich person's car. One woman was taken while she was grading her students' homework. One especially unfortunate person had been separated from their group while on a trip to Spain, and they saw their group on the way to the ship. Part 2. Item 6027 didn't always hate his life. Sure, the vast majority of it he definitely hated, but there were some days he could almost feel the ghost of happiness. His captors had to occasionally stop at foreign planets. If the abductees had been on good behavior, a few of them would be taken to visit the planet's surface. Of course, they were all taken out at separate times so that they'd never see each other, but it was still nice to see the sky once in a while, even if it was nothing like on Earth. One time they landed on an open field and Item 6027 had thought they'd brought him back. He even thought he recognized most of the plants around him. But they never removed the cuffs on his wrists or ankles, so he didn't bother trying to run. Besides, he'd had a taste of their taser sticks, and he was in no rush to feel that pain again. He'd also once been allowed onto a planet that had seemed to be entirely covered in water. At least, that's what he assumed, because they'd landed in the water instead of on dry land, like they usually would. He was given a breathing apparatus and allowed to swim around. He had never learned how to swim, so it was more barely controlled floating, but seeing all the foreign fish and plants was almost exciting. The prisoners were given plenty of free time in their cells, but they were never given anything to do. Some of the humans eventually stopped talking altogether out of boredom. Then again, for all he knew, they could have died. He hoped it was the latter, for their sakes. Item 6027 used to use his time to imagine escaping, but after his miserable failure when he did attempt escaping, he used much of his time trying to imagine the things the other humans told stories about. It had been so long since he'd seen Earth that he nearly forgot what it looked like. For most of his life, his world was the 4 white walls around him, and the endless experiments performed on him. Probably the strangest experiment they performed on him was when they made a basketball court and had him play against robots. He never exercised, but the robots were initially programmed to be able to play anyway. At first, he made 2 shots, but the robots were clearly designed to be learning computers, and they quickly outstripped his limited abilities. By the end of the first quarter, he just sat on the court away from the action, and watched as they performed feats that no human could ever hope to accomplish. Part 3. Item 6027 dreamed of the day that this would be all over. The endless experiments, the 4 white walls, the feeling as the other abductees fell silent. It was a nightmare, but he couldn't wake up from it. No matter how many times he asked, begged, screamed, his captors never explained why they took him, or what the experiments were even for. He knew they spoke English because that was how they told him what to do, but they continued to refuse to answer them. One day, during an experiment where they held him over a tub of water, he saw that his hair had grown entirely white. He had wrinkles all over his face, his scars all over his body had started sagging. His arms had grown too weak to even lift above his head. He would have cried if he hadn't dried up long ago. Sometime later, he found he could barely even stand up from his small bed anymore. When he was called for another experiment, he couldn't even walk to the door anymore. So he just sat on his bed and just tried to keep breathing. But the noise wouldn't stop, repeating over and over and over and over again, telling him to walk outside. But he couldn't, and it wouldn't stop. He tried to tell them he couldn't, but he knew they wouldn't listen. After an eternity, the sound finally shut off. He laid down on his bed and placed his arms over his eyes. He heard the door open and felt as his captors grabbed his arms and legs. Even if he had the strength left, he wouldn't have fought. He'd been dreaming of this day for far too long. He wondered how many of the humans were left. He'd been the youngest, and he hoped that he wouldn't leave any completely alone. Saying thank you under his breath, he allowed his captors to place him onto a floating cloth table. They didn't bother with tying him down anymore. Without a word, he was placed inside a dark tube. His normal bed was always uncomfortable, but this bed felt like he was floating on a cloud. He closed his eyes as he felt himself become weightless. As he was ejected from the spaceship, he felt sharp cold piercing his entire body. His breath left him as the vacuum of space took him from the tube. Before losing his sight for the final time, he opened his eyes to see a white star coming towards him. Or rather, he was going towards it. His final thought was, if the rest of my life had been meaningless, at least I will spend the rest of eternity as Stardust.